5 years ago, he threw her out of his mansion. Today, the billionaire would give anything for a minute with her and their daughter. Hello, everyone. If you've ever been underestimated, this is the story for you. A tale of betrayal, redemption, and the power of building your own destiny. Like, subscribe, and get ready for a night that will change everything. Let's begin. Julian Thorne had built his entire life on discipline, control, and the unwavering belief that emotions were nothing more than weaknesses that destroyed men of power. As the CEO of one of the country's most influential corporations, he had grown accustomed to giving orders that were followed without question, to closing deals where hesitation could cost billions, and to wearing a mask of cold confidence that never cracked. With perfectly slicked dark hair and eyes so cold and blue that his subordinates often avoided his gaze, Julian was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke. To the outside world, he was untouchable, the embodiment of success, the man who could not be swayed by anyone or anything. Yet his meticulously constructed image was threatened the moment Alara Vance, the woman who had unexpectedly slipped through his armor, confessed that she was expecting his child. She had not come to him with accusations or demands, but with a trembling hope, believing that perhaps the love she had given him would be reciprocated in this moment of vulnerability. Alara's dark hair framed her delicate face. Her blue eyes searched his for a sign of warmth, of reassurance, of the man she believed existed beneath the exterior he showed the rest of the world. But Julian, instead of feeling joy or tenderness, felt only the ice of panic spreading through him. A child did not fit into his plans. A child meant exposure, distraction, vulnerability. He stood before her in the great hall of his mansion, its marble floors reflecting the distance that was already growing between them. His voice, quiet but razor-sharp, filled the silence with words that would be etched into her memory forever. "You have 24 hours to leave this house," he said, each syllable precise and ruthless. There was no room for negotiation, no softness in his tone, no trace of the affection he had once shown her. It wasn't anger that fueled his cruelty, but fear, a fear he couldn't admit even to himself, so he masked it with finality. Alara felt the world collapse around her. She had known Julian could be cold. She had glimpsed the ruthless man beneath his charm, but she had never imagined he would cast her aside so completely in the moment she needed him most. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in his presence. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why the man she loved had vanished, but instead, she stood tall, clutching the strap of her purse as if it were the only thing grounding her to reality. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was defiance, though in that moment she was too heartbroken to recognize it as such. The house, in all its opulence, suddenly felt like a gilded cage closing in on her. Every corner, every piece of art, and every polished surface reminded her of what she was losing. Not just comfort, but the illusion that she had ever been truly loved. Without another word, she turned, the echo of her footsteps ringing through the empty halls as Julian remained where he stood, rigid and unyielding. She left with only what she could carry, her heart shattered, her future uncertain, and a tiny life growing inside her that would soon become her reason to endure. As the heavy doors closed behind her, Julian exhaled for the first time since the conversation had begun. He told himself it was the right choice, that she had been a distraction, that sentimentality was a sickness that weakened men like him. He repeated these lies until they sounded like truth, convincing himself that in 24 hours he would never think of her again. But even as he climbed the grand staircase back to his empty study, there was a flicker of unease inside him, a whisper he quickly drowned out with arrogance. He didn't know it yet, But the decision he made that night would haunt him for years, ringing louder than any business victory, overshadowing every success, until the day he came face to face with the daughter he had denied. Ilara left the mansion that night with nothing but a suitcase and a hollow ache in her chest that felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. The echo of Julian's words, cold, sharp, and final, followed her into the darkness like a curse. She had no plan, no safety net, and no one waiting to catch her. The city that glittered outside her world's windows looked very different as she stepped into it alone, vulnerable, and pregnant. The first few nights were the hardest. She rented a small, damp apartment in a neighborhood far removed from the luxury she had known, and as she lay on a mattress that sagged beneath her weight, she realized she would have to summon a strength she had never believed herself capable of. The following months were a relentless test. She worked as many shifts as her body would allow, waiting tables at a busy cafe where customers barely looked at her face. As her belly began to show, she endured the stares and the whispered judgments, but she held her head high because she was carrying a reason to endure inside her. Her hands ached from scrubbing dishes, her feet blistered from hours on the floor, and sometimes she went to bed hungry so she could save a few more dollars for what was to come. Yet no amount of exhaustion could eclipse the quiet moments at night when she would place her hands on her stomach and whisper to the child growing inside her, promising love, protection, and a home, even if she had to build it from nothing. When Celia was born, Ilara felt triumph and heartbreak crash over her in equal measure. The baby's dark hair curled against her tiny head. Her large blue eyes blinked with curiosity at the world she had just entered. She was beautiful, perfect, and yet every feature reminded her of Julian, of the man who had cast them aside. For one fragile moment, as she held the baby and felt the warmth of her tiny body, Ilara's heart ached with the memory of what could have been. But then Celia let out a small cry, a sound that was both fragile and demanding, and Ilara's sadness hardened into determination. This child would never feel unwanted. This child would never doubt her mother's love. Raising Celia alone proved to be even harder than Ilara had imagined. Nights bled into days as she tried to balance caring for a baby with keeping a roof over their heads. She often came home from work so exhausted she thought she might collapse. But the moment Celia stirred in her crib, Ilara found the strength to keep going. She learned to hand-sew tiny clothes when she couldn't afford new ones, to stretch meals to last the week, to turn loneliness into stories she whispered to her daughter about a brighter future. The outside world was ruthless, but inside their small apartment, Ilara created a haven of warmth where laughter and lullabies replaced the silence of abandonment. There were moments of despair, moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. Bills piled up, shifts were cut short, and there were nights she cried silently into her pillow after Celia had fallen asleep. But each time, she would remind herself of the little girl who depended on her, who looked up at her with eyes so full of trust it made her chest ache. That trust became Ilara's anchor, her proof that she was not broken, her reminder that she was building something far more valuable than wealth or status. Over the years, Celia grew into an energetic child who filled every corner of their modest home with joy. Her laughter was a melody that erased the day's fatigue. Her questions were endless and curious, her hugs fierce with affection. Every milestone, her first steps, her first words, her first drawings with tiny crooked hearts, was a victory. Ilara celebrated in silence, often with tears she didn't bother to hide. And though every one of her daughter's features carried the shadow of Julian's face, Ilara chose not to think of the man who had cast them out. Instead, She focused on the bond she shared with Celia, a bond forged in sacrifice, resilience, and unconditional love. Deep down, though, Elara knew the past had never truly left. There were moments when Celia would tilt her head a certain way, or smile with a too familiar deviousness that Elara felt the ghost of Julian hovering at the edges of her life. She forced herself to push the thought away, to remind herself that he no longer mattered, that the world they had built together, just the two of them, was stronger than the wounds he had left behind. But fate has a cruel way of bringing back what we try hardest to bury. And though she didn't know it yet, the world she had so carefully built was about to collide with the one she thought she had escaped forever. Do you think fate truly brought them together again, or is it just a cruel coincidence? Let me know your opinion in the comments. 5 years slipped by with a strange blend of exhaustion and silent triumph for Elara. What started as nights of fear and struggle had slowly morphed into a life built around love and resilience. Celia had grown into a vivacious child, with dark hair that curled softly around her cheeks and eyes so vividly blue they could cut through any darkness. She was a constant reminder of Julian, but where his gaze had been cold and sharp, Celia's eyes radiated warmth, curiosity, and an innocence that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Their small apartment was still modest, the furniture worn and the walls in need of paint. But within its confines, laughter flourished, and the bond between mother and daughter grew into something unbreakable. Elara had found a more stable job at a hotel, starting as a front desk clerk, and eventually proving herself reliable enough to handle more responsibilities. The job didn't bring wealth, but it brought stability, and that was enough. Each day she greeted guests with her polite smile, hid her weariness behind a professional calm, and returned home to a child whose hug could erase the day's fatigue. Sometimes, as she passed the high windows of the lobby and saw her reflection, she barely recognized herself. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had been cast out of a mansion in disgrace. She had become someone harder, steadier, a woman who had carried a burden alone and refused to break beneath its weight. Celia's personality began to shine in ways that surprised Elara. She was witty and playful, endlessly curious about the world around her. She would pepper her mother with questions at bedtime, asking why the sky was blue, why people wore suits, why some people walked with sad faces while others smiled. Sometimes, she would press her tiny hands to Elara's cheeks and say, "Don't worry, Mommy, I'll take care of you when I'm big." Those words melted Elara every time, even though she knew it was supposed to be the other way around. Despite the joy, there were always shadows lurking at the edges of Elara's heart. Every so often, when Celia laughed in a way that sounded like Julian or tilted her head with that same sharpness in her gaze, Elara's chest would tighten with the memory of what had been taken from them. She had trained herself to push his image away, to remind herself that he had chosen to cast them out, that he was not a part of their world. But some nights, when Celia was asleep and the apartment was silent, Elara would wonder if he ever thought of them, if he ever regretted the cold finality of his words. She hated herself for asking the question, because the answer wouldn't change a thing. Life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Elara had learned to stretch her earnings, to mend broken toys, to turn simple dinners into feasts when she pretended the mismatched plates were part of a grand banquet. And Celia never knew what was missing. She didn't feel the absence of a father, because Elara made sure her world was full of love. Neighbors would often comment on the child's bright spirit and her astonishing eyes, asking if she had any relatives who looked the same. Elara would smile politely, but inside she felt the sting of a truth she would never share. Then came the night the fragile line between the past and the present began to blur. Ilara was finishing her shift at the hotel, checking in a group of businessmen, when Celia came running into the lobby holding a drawing she had made, dropped off to her by a kind neighbor who sometimes helped watch the child. Ilara's eyes softened as she knelt to receive her daughter, but the moment froze as she noticed the tall figure entering the lobby. He was unmistakable, even after years of separation. Julian Thorne strode through the revolving doors, his dark hair as perfectly slicked as she remembered, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a man who still owned every space he entered. He looked untouched by time, though his face held lines that hinted at a restlessness and weariness. For one breathless moment, Ilara thought she was seeing a ghost, conjured by the exhaustion of too many long days. But he wasn't a ghost. He was real, and as his gaze landed on her, it stopped, fixed and hardened. She felt her body go rigid, her instincts screaming to shield Celia and run, yet she was rooted to the spot by the shock of his presence. And then, as if the world itself conspired to betray her, Celia looked up at the tall stranger with the same blue eyes that mirrored his own. Julian's face changed in an instant. The mask of control, the veneer of authority he wore like armor, cracked as recognition slammed into him. He saw himself in the child's face, in the color of her eyes, in the shape of her jaw. His empire, his success, his carefully constructed world, all of it meant nothing in the span of a single heartbeat. Ilara's chest clenched as she gripped Celia's hand tighter, but she knew it was too late. Julian Thorne had seen the child. He had seen the truth she had kept hidden for 5 years. And in that one moment, everything she had fought to protect was suddenly in danger of falling apart. Julian stood frozen in the lobby, his carefully maintained composure cracking in a way that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or impending scandal. For years, he had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that the decisions he made in the pursuit of control and power were final, irreversible, and justified. Yet here, in the middle of a hotel full of strangers, a little girl with big blue eyes had laid him bare, with nothing but her existence. He looked at her as if the ground beneath his feet had given way, the polished marble floor turning to sand, pulling him into a past he had spent half a decade trying to bury. Ilara's heart pounded as she bent down, pulling Celia gently against her side, shielding her as if she could physically block the truth from reaching him. She kept her face carefully composed, but her pulse betrayed her calm, thrumming like a drum of panic. She had imagined this moment countless times in her nightmares. Julian, appearing without warning, discovering the child he had rejected before her birth, and demanding a place in a life he had no right to belong to. And now it was happening, and the sheer weight of his gaze told her that denial was no longer possible. He knew, without a word, without a question. He knew. The crowd around them seemed to fade away, the voices of guests, the drag of luggage, the clinking of glasses from the bar, all of it blended into a distant hum. Julian took a single step forward, his expression raw with disbelief, his lips parted as if words could push their way out, but nothing came from his throat. His mind reeled back through years of loneliness, through the hollow victories of business deals and awards, through the solitary nights in his sprawling house, where the silence pressed in harder than any enemy. For the first time, he understood what that silence had been trying to tell him, that it was not power he lacked, it was her, and it was this child, his daughter, whose life had unfolded without him. "Don't," Ilara said suddenly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The single word stopped him mid-stride. Her eyes, once soft and pleading in the days when she had loved him without reservation, were now steel, and the sight of that strength wounded him almost as much as the child's presence. He had expected anger, maybe even hatred, but not this quiet, unyielding wall that told him he was an intruder. Celia looked between them with innocent curiosity, her tiny hand clutching Alara's skirt. "Mommy?" she asked in a clear, ringing voice that made Julian's breath catch. "Why is that man looking at us like he knows us?" Her question was innocent, but it sliced through Alara like a blade. She had spent 5 years preparing to answer every hard question, but not this one. Not now. Not here. Julian finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uneven. Nothing like the commanding tone the world associated with his name. "Alara," he managed, the syllables heavy with regret. His eyes went to the child, then back to the woman he had once cast out, and his throat tightened until the rest of his words dissolved into silence. He wanted to say her name again, to beg for an explanation even though he already knew the truth, to confess that he saw himself in the child's face so clearly it was unbearable. Alara straightened, her hand smoothing Celia's hair, her posture radiating a protectiveness that was both instinctive and deliberate. Her reply was quiet but firm, each word measured with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for years. "She is mine, Julian. Mine alone." The weight of those words crushed him. They carried not only the reality of his absence, but also the finality of a sentence that left no room for redemption. He felt as though the entire lobby had closed in on him, that every stranger could see right through his perfectly tailored suit and recognize the emptiness beneath. He had believed himself untouchable, yet here he was, undone by the innocent gaze of a child and the defiance of a woman who had once loved him. Alara tightened her grip on Celia's hand and turned for the exit. Every step she took away from him cut more deeply than the last, and yet he couldn't move. He couldn't follow them, as if invisible chains bound him to the spot. The sound of their heels against the marble floor echoed like a pounding gavel, each click a judgment, each step a reminder of the years he had lost and could never get back. For the first time in his life, Julian Thorne, billionaire, industry titan, a man who commanded empires, was rendered powerless, not by a rival or a financial disaster, but by a choice he had made 5 years ago with arrogance and fear. And as the revolving doors closed behind Alara and Celia, leaving him alone in the opulent lobby, he felt the full force of that choice come crashing down on him in a way no defeat ever had. Was the encounter a second chance or the final punishment of his past? Let us know your opinion in the comments. That night, Julian didn't sleep. He lay in his vast, empty bedroom, staring at the ceiling as the image of the child's face replayed itself over and over in his mind. He could still see her eyes, so impossibly blue and familiar, the same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. For 5 years, he had convinced himself that his decision to drive Alara away had been necessary, that he had preserved his empire by eliminating what he saw as a liability. He had built his life on the belief that feelings were weaknesses, and that everything of importance could be bought, controlled, or discarded if it threatened his plans. But standing in that hotel lobby, looking into the eyes of a child who was undeniably his, those beliefs had been shattered. He had missed her first steps, her first words, her laughter, her tears, all the pieces of a life he could never get back. The realization hit him with a force that almost broke him. He had been living as half a man, pretending to be whole. The next day, he tried to lose himself in work, but the numbers on contracts blurred before his eyes. The voices of his executives droned on, and he found himself staring out the window, lost in thoughts he couldn't silence. For the first time in his career, his empire seemed brittle, empty, a monument to nothing. No amount of money could buy back 5 years. No deal could erase the fact that he had chosen pride over love, arrogance over responsibility. The more he thought of Alara carrying their child alone, the more his chest tightened with a guilt that made breathing painful. He remembered her eyes the night he had told her to leave, how they had pleaded for love, and how he had responded with cruelty. Now those same eyes burned with strength and defiance, and he wondered if he hadn't just destroyed her trust, but also any chance of redemption. The days passed in torment. He began showing up at the hotel more frequently, inventing reasons for meetings, trying to catch a glimpse of Alara and the child he now knew was his daughter. Every time he saw them, his resolve to make things right grew, even though he had no idea how to begin. Finally, one night, he found the courage to approach Alara as she was leaving work. She walked quickly, her daughter's hand gripped tightly in hers, but Julian stepped into their path. His voice was shaky, stripped of its usual authority. "Please, Alara," he said, the desperation in his tone undeniable. "Let me talk to you. Let me at least see her. I know I don't deserve it, but I can't pretend anymore." Alara's expression was unreadable, her shoulders squared, her chin held high. She didn't scream or lash out as he had half expected. Instead, she looked at him with a quiet calm that hit him harder than rage. "You offered me money when I asked for love," she said, her voice steady, but low enough for only him to hear. "You turned your back on us when we needed you most. I'm not going to let you do that to her. She deserves a father who didn't walk away before she was born." The words cut deeper than any accusation because they were true. He had no defense, no excuse that could erase the past. He tried again, reaching for something, anything that could convince her. "I was wrong," he admitted, his throat tight. "I was afraid, and I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was lose everything that mattered. I don't expect you to forgive me, but don't shut the door on her life completely. Please, Alara." Her eyes softened for only a moment before hardening again. "Do you think regret changes what you did? Regret doesn't raise a child. Regret doesn't pay for the sleepless nights or mend broken promises. You are too late, Julian." She turned then, pulling Celia gently away, and he was left frozen, watching them disappear into the night. When he returned to his penthouse that night, the silence was unbearable. He walked through the endless rooms filled with expensive furniture and art, but everything felt meaningless. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he would trade every piece of it for a chance to tuck his daughter into bed, for a chance to hear her call him father. But he also knew Alara was right. Regret alone wasn't enough. If he truly wanted to be a part of Celia's life, if he wanted to earn even a sliver of Alara's trust, he would have to prove it not with words, but with actions. And this time, there could be no arrogance, no shortcuts, and no turning back. Lying awake once more, he stared at the skyline outside his window, the glittering city mocking him with its indifference. He had everything, and yet nothing. And as the hours passed, one thought crystallized with painful clarity. He could no longer live as the man he had been. If he truly wanted to be a father, if he wanted to reclaim the love he had thrown away, he would have to dismantle the fortress of pride he had built around himself and face the consequences of his choices, no matter how much it cost him. Do you think a person can truly change? Or do old habits always come back? Comment your opinion. A week passed as the fragile wall between Julian and the life he had thrown away began to crack. He had returned to the hotel almost every evening, careful to keep his distance, but unable to resist the pull that drew him there. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of Alara, always moving quickly, her posture tense, her eyes refusing to land on him. Other times, he would see the child, Celia, skipping along beside her mother with her hair shining dark under the lobby lights, her small hand clutching a stuffed toy. Every time he saw her, his heart would clench with a force he couldn't control, and he wondered if she felt something in him, if blood had its own silent way of calling out. The moment came unexpectedly one afternoon, when Alara was speaking to a colleague at the front desk. Celia had grown restless and wandered a few feet away, humming a tune as she fiddled with the hem of her dress. Julian had been sitting in a corner of the lobby, pretending to review documents, though he hadn't read a single line. His eyes lifted as the little girl stopped in front of him. She tilted her head, studying him in that direct, unwavering way that children have, and then smiled faintly. "You have eyes like me," she said simply, her voice filled with a straightforward wonder that cut right through him. Julian's breath caught in his throat. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't even blink, as the truth of her words wrapped around him like a chain. Slowly, almost fearfully, he set his papers aside and lowered himself to her height. He had faced boardrooms full of rivals, government officials, and hostile investors, but he had never felt so exposed. "Yes," he whispered, his voice rough. "I do." He wanted to reach out, but he kept his hands still, terrified of breaking the fragile thread that had formed between them. Alara's voice cut through the air, sharp and urgent. "Celia!" She was across the lobby in seconds, her hand on her daughter's shoulder, pulling her back with a protective force. Her eyes locked on Julian's, and the warning in them was unmistakable. Yet beneath the steel, there was a flicker of something else. Fear, not just for her daughter, but for herself. She had worked for years to keep this barrier intact, and in one innocent exchange, her daughter had dismantled it. From that day on, nothing was the same. Celia began to ask questions, her natural curiosity refusing to be stifled. Who was that man? Why does he look at me like he knows me? Why are his eyes like mine? Alara tried to evade, tried to bury the truth under vague answers. But the questions grew bolder, and the child's persistence wore down her resolve. She realized that forbidding contact entirely would only feed Celia's curiosity. So reluctantly, painfully, she allowed Julian small, supervised encounters. The first time he was allowed to sit with them in the park, Julian felt as though he had been handed a treasure too delicate for his unworthy hands. He fumbled through the simplest tasks. Reading aloud from a children's book made his voice stumble. The boys in his company had always been business partners or employees, not wide-eyed children who demanded funny voices and exaggerated expressions. Playing tag in the grass left him clumsy, his polished shoes slipping, his expensive suit jacket discarded in defeat as Celia laughed and outran him with ease. And yet for every misstep, there was a smile, a laugh, a moment of trust that filled him with a joy so profound it ached in his chest. Alara watched from the sidelines, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. She waited for him to grow frustrated, to retreat into the arrogance that had defined him for so long. But he kept coming back, day after day, often in simple clothes she had never seen him wear, free of the armor of wealth and power. He would listen to Celia's endless stories, letting her explain the elaborate rules of games she made up on the spot, nodding solemnly as if she were giving the most important report of his career. When she scraped her knee on the sidewalk, he knelt beside her with a startling tenderness, wiping away the dirt and whispering words of reassurance until her tears calmed. For Julian, these moments were revelations. He had pictured himself as a master of control, yet here he was, being taught by a child to laugh without restraint, to fail without shame, to give without expecting anything in return. Every one of Celia's smiles felt like a gift he didn't deserve. Every small gesture of trust, a fragile step toward something he thought he had lost forever. At night, when he returned to his empty penthouse, he no longer saw it as a symbol of power, but as a prison of his own making. The silence taunted him with all the years he had missed, but for the first time, there was hope burning beneath the regret. Elara, however, couldn't allow herself to be swayed by his transformation. She reminded herself daily of the man he had been, the pain he had inflicted, the coldness with which he had once cast her out. Yet as she watched him sitting cross-legged in the grass, letting Celia braid his hair with clumsy little fingers, or saw the tenderness in his eyes when he kissed his daughter's forehead, she felt her defenses weakening. Despite herself, she began to wonder if redemption was possible, if change was real, if the man she had loved so desperately years ago had been buried, waiting for a chance to return. By the time the sun set that night, and Celia had fallen asleep in his lap, her tiny hand curled around his thumb as if it had always belonged there, Elara realized with a sharp pang that the walls she had built were no longer impenetrable. She wasn't ready to forgive, but she could no longer deny what she was seeing. Julian was fighting for his place in their lives, and though she hated herself for it, she could feel him beginning to win. The weeks that followed felt like a tightrope walk for Elara, each step a balance between protecting the life she had built and allowing the man who had once shattered it to get close. She had vowed to herself that she would never let Julian Thorne back into her heart. Yet each day he returned with the same quiet persistence, showing up not with arrogance or demands, but with an unfamiliar humility that unnerved her more than his old cruelty. He was not the Julian she remembered, the man who had placed power above love and cast her out without a second thought. This man stumbled through bedtime stories, listened patiently when Celia rambled about her imaginary worlds, and stood awkwardly in the kitchen trying to help with dinner, even when he was clearly out of his element. He seemed determined to prove, in 100 small ways, that his desire to change was real. Elara resisted at first, watching his every move with suspicion, her heart still bleeding from the memory of the coldness with which he had once rejected her. One night, however, when Celia had fallen asleep on her lap after an exhausting day at the park, Elara walked into the living room to find him sitting completely still, as if even shifting his weight might break the spell. His hand rested softly on their daughter's back, his eyes wet as he stared at her tiny face. There was no performance in him, no calculated gesture, just a man overwhelmed with love and regret. Elara stood silently in the doorway, her chest tightening at the sight, because it was the first time she allowed herself to admit that maybe he had truly changed. Later that night, after Celia had been carried to her bed, Elara and Julian found themselves sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence heavy but not hostile. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice hoarse as he spoke. He confessed that the night he had told her to leave was the moment he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He admitted he had been ruled by fear, terrified of vulnerability, of love, of the messiness that came with being human. He had convinced himself that money could solve everything, that power was enough, and in the process, he had destroyed the only thing that could have given the empire he had built meaning. His words came out haltingly at first, but as he spoke, the dam of his silence broke, and years of buried regret poured out. Elara listened without interrupting, though her arms were tightly crossed in front of her, as if she were shielding herself from the pull of his confession. His words stirred up the old wounds she had tried to bury, wounds that had never fully healed. When he finished, she let the silence linger before finally speaking, her voice steady and sharp. She told him that his absence had not only broken her heart, but had forced her to carry a burden alone that should have been shared. She described the endless nights she had held a crying baby in her arms, exhausted and terrified, with no one to lean on. She told him about the bills that had almost crushed her, the hunger she had endured so that Celia would not feel it, the desperation that had clawed at her when she thought she couldn't go on. Her words were not accusations but truths, spoken with a quiet strength that shook him more than screaming. Julian didn't defend himself, didn't try to excuse the choices he had made. He only bowed his head, letting the pain of her words wash over him like a punishment he knew he deserved. When he finally lifted his eyes to her, they were filled with emotion, and he whispered that he could never undo what he had done, never erase the scars he had left, but that he wanted, he needed, the chance to be the man both she and their daughter deserved. He promised he wouldn't walk away again, no matter how difficult it got, or how much she doubted him. He begged not for forgiveness, but for the chance to prove himself, one day at a time. For a moment, Ilara wanted to send him away, to cling to her anger and her fear, because they had protected her for so long. But then she thought of Celia, of the way her daughter's face lit up every time Julian entered the room, of the pure, unreserved joy in her laughter when he played with her. She couldn't ignore that her daughter had already opened her heart to him, and to deny that bond would only hurt Celia in the end. So she looked at him across the table and told him plainly that she couldn't promise forgiveness. Not now. Maybe not ever. She told him that if he wanted to remain in Celia's life, he would have to earn it with every single action. That one misstep, one sign of the man he had been, and she would close the door for good. Julian nodded, his jaw set, but his eyes steady. He told her he understood, that he expected no less, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy. For the first time since the night he had cast her out, she saw no arrogance in him, only a fragile sincerity that frightened her, because it was real. That night, as she lay awake listening to her daughter's steady breathing in the next room, Ilara realized that the battle she had been fighting for years was no longer just about protecting herself. It was about deciding whether to allow the possibility of redemption, whether to let hope seep back into the cracks she had so tightly sealed. She wasn't ready to trust him yet, but as she remembered the look in his eyes when Celia had called him Daddy for the first time earlier that week, she knew something had changed. The man she had thought was lost forever might still exist, buried under regret and pride, now fighting to resurface. And the most terrifying part was that her heart, despite everything, still wanted to believe in him. The spring sunlight spilled softly through the curtains of Ilara's apartment, filling the rooms with a warmth that felt strangely new, as if the season itself had decided to bless the fragile changes unfolding in their lives. Weeks of slow, cautious interaction had grown into a routine that none of them had expected, but all three had begun to cherish. Julian now arrived not as a figure from a distant world of power and wealth, but as a man stripped of titles, slipping into the role of a father with a fumbling sincerity that disarmed both Ilara and Celia. He would sit on the floor with coloring books scattered around him, his expensive watch forgotten as he tried to stay inside the crooked lines, laughing when Celia corrected him. He would take her to the park, pushing her on the swings until her shouts of joy filled the air, his hand steadying her with a tenderness that seemed impossible for the man who once lived for control and intimidation. Each day, in countless small ways, he proved that his desire to change was real. Ilara watched all of this with a heart that was both cautious and unsettled. She hadn't forgotten the night he gave her 24 hours to leave, nor the endless years of raising a daughter alone. That wound would always remain a part of her, and she couldn't erase it even if she wanted to. Yet she also couldn't deny the man she saw before her now. There was no arrogance in his eyes when he looked at Celia, only wonder and fear. The wonder of being given a second chance, and the fear of losing it all over again. And sometimes, when their eyes met across the table, or during those quiet moments when Celia fell asleep between them, Ilara felt the dangerous pull of the old love she had long buried, resurfacing in ways she couldn't fully fight. The true test came one night when Celia fell ill with a sudden fever. Ilara's hands trembled as she tried to cool her daughter's forehead with a wet cloth, panic scratching at her chest as memories of lonely nights with a crying baby returned in full force. But this time, she wasn't alone. Julian stayed by her side, holding Celia in his arms, with a steadiness that surprised them both, whispering calming words to her as Ilara fetched medicine and paced with worry. He refused to leave for even a moment, and when Celia finally fell into a restless sleep, her tiny hand still clutching his shirt, Ilara looked at him and saw the truth of his transformation written in his exhaustion, in the tenderness of his gaze, in the quiet strength he offered without asking for thanks. Something inside her broke then, not from pain, but from release, as if the fortress she had built around herself was finally crumbling. Later that night, as Celia rested peacefully, Ilara and Julian found themselves sitting together in the living room, the silence heavy but not hostile. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice hoarse as he spoke. He told her that every day with their daughter felt like a gift he hadn't earned, and that the fear of losing them haunted him more than any business risk. He admitted that the life he had once clung to, the empire, the wealth, the reputation, was nothing compared to the simple joy of hearing Celia's laughter or the rare moments when Ilara allowed him a glimpse of her smile. He said he would give it all away, every last bit of his fortune, if it meant keeping them in his life. And for once, Ilara believed him. She didn't reply right away. She sat in silence, listening to the hum of the city outside, feeling the weight of years of pain pressing against the fragile beginnings of trust. But then she reached out, slowly, uncertainly, and placed her hand over his. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement that the man she saw now was no longer the man who had once cast her out. For Julian, that simple touch meant more than any treachery he had ever achieved, for it carried with it the promise of possibility. The next few days unfolded with a new kind of peace. Celia no longer asked why her father looked at her strangely, because she no longer saw him as a stranger. She would climb into his lap without hesitation, pull on his hand. When she wanted to play, and fall asleep on his shoulder, as if she had always known he belonged there. Ilara began to notice how naturally he fit into the rhythms of her life, how his presence no longer felt like an intrusion, but like something that had been missing all along. She didn't tell him she had forgiven him, for forgiveness wasn't a single moment but a slow, fragile process. Yet in her heart, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story was not defined by the cruelty of the past, but by the courage of what they were building now. On one quiet evening, as Celia slept peacefully in her room, Julian and Ilara stood together by the window, looking out at the glittering city lights. He slid his arm carefully around her shoulders, half expecting her to pull away. But she didn't. She leaned into him, just a little, enough to let him know she was no longer carrying the burden alone. For Julian, it was the culmination of everything he had longed for, not the grand displays of wealth or triumph, but the simple, quiet acceptance of the woman he had once lost, and the child who had brought them back together. The man who had once given her 24 hours to leave his house now knew he would spend the rest of his life fighting to stay by her side. And as Alara stood with him in the city's glow, their daughter safe and loved, she allowed herself to believe in something she hadn't dared to for years. A future that wasn't broken, but whole. Built not on power or pride, but on the love they had finally found the courage to reclaim.